Hello, everyone, and welcome to Navigating Uncertainty in Federal Funding Streams for Housing. We are just going to give it another minute or two for folks to join, and then we'll jump in. Still seeing folks trickle in, so another minute. All right, let's get started. My name is Claudia Aiken. I am Director of New Research Partnerships for the Housing Solutions Lab. Next slide, please. Thanks. So if you're not familiar with the lab, we are based at the NYU Furman Center. Our mission is to help small and mid-sized cities plan, launch, and evaluate housing policy with the goal of advancing racial equity, health, and well-being. Our work generally falls into three buckets: direct engagement with the cities, research partnerships both to inform and to learn from innovative policy at the local level, and original policy and data analysis. Turning now to our agenda for today, we are first very excited to welcome Solomon Green, Executive Director for Land and Communities at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. He's our collaborator for the webinar today, and Solomon is just going to set the stage for us with some opening remarks about the shifts we are seeing at the federal level. We'll then move into a presentation of what we've heard from cities as they navigate uncertainty in federal funding streams for housing, as well as the analysis we've done to unpack and map those streams at the local level, and some suggestions about how other places can replicate this analysis for their own communities. The presentation will be followed by a moderated panel featuring three local experts who are thinking proactively about how to prepare for the risks to federal funding streams flowing into their communities, which include Chattanooga, Tennessee, Charlottesville, Virginia, and Louisville, Kentucky. After that moderated portion, we will have about 15 minutes for your questions. So please feel free to drop those into the Q&A at any time during the presentation or during the panel, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. But now, without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic over to Solomon.
1 second. Great. Thank you so much, Claudia. And we're delighted at the Lincoln Institute to be partnering with NYU Furman Center and the Housing Solutions Lab on this project. I'm really excited to be co-hosting this webinar with you today. Prior to joining the Lincoln Institute earlier this year, I served in the Biden-Harris administration, where I led HUD's Office of Policy Development and Research. And I know as we were preparing for this webinar, you asked me to speak a bit about my unique perspective coming from HUD and in that role. But I actually thought about it a little bit more, and I prefer to go back much earlier to when I started my career working on affordable housing at the local level in the San Francisco Bay Area. My first job at a college was working for the Mayor's Office of Housing in San Francisco, which was responsible for programming a range of federal funds for housing and community development, including home and CDBG and emergency shelter grants. And I'm dating myself a bit, but I started in 1996, which was the same year that the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, or federal welfare reform, was passed, the most sweeping welfare reform act in our nation's history, which significantly limited access to social safety net programs. And I was staffing the mayor's welfare reform task force, where we looked at how these cuts to safety nets would impact families and communities, including through increased need for rental assistance and the risk of increased homelessness, and how local leaders could respond to these drastic changes. My next job was working at a local community-based nonprofit affordable housing developer, including helping to negotiate a major renovation and upgrade to Valencia Gardens, a large public housing community in San Francisco's Mission District, using Hope 6 funding from HUD. And I was responsible for building support from neighborhood leaders for the project and to help ensure that existing residents of Valencia Gardens fully benefited from the improvements. And these early experiences taught me 3 lessons relevant to our conversation today, and they've only been reinforced over the nearly 3 decades I've been working in affordable housing and community development since. First, local communities cannot address their pressing housing needs without a federal partnership. Every project I worked on in San Francisco, both those funded by the mayor's office or those built and redeveloped in San Francisco's Mission District, involved some level of federal funding to make the deals pencil out, to make rents affordable to the city's most vulnerable residents, and to support homeownership options for hardworking families for whom they would otherwise be out of reach. Cities and states have a lot of tools in their toolboxes to support healthy, thriving, and inclusive communities in affordable housing, but they can't do it alone. Second, it isn't just federal housing policy and housing funding that supports healthy housing markets and housing stability and affordability, but also other federal policies and funding streams. It's also crucial, the federal safety net programs are crucial, as are responsible and accountable financial systems and institutions, and federal funding for transportation and infrastructure. These are all key ingredients that make new housing production possible and connect people to opportunities. This fragile but essential ecosystem of federal-local partnerships became so apparent to me just as it was being frayed during the first wave of sweeping federal reform in the late 90s. And it is even more apparent to me today with sweeping cuts to Medicaid and SNAP, and with historic federal investments in affordable transportation and resilient infrastructure being halted or clawed back. The third lesson is we need quality research and timely data to solve the nation's growing housing crisis. We need research on what works and how to constantly improve housing policies and programs. And we need timely, granular, and reliable data on housing markets, supply gaps, and affordability and access trends to innovate and make data-driven and evidence-based decisions. The federal government, and particularly the office I led at HUD, plays a vital role in providing this public data infrastructure to drive state and local decision-making. And civil society and research institutions like the NYU Furman Center also have a vital role to play. But we also need data on federal funding flows to states and localities to understand how federal support enables thriving local housing markets and access to safe, quality, and affordable housing. We need these data to make the case for a continued federal-local partnership, but also to demonstrate how federal support delivers real and positive outcomes for people and communities, to identify inequities and risks associated with federal housing cuts or policy changes, and to anticipate and adapt to those changes. We'll address all of these themes and topics on the webinar today. And in a moment, I'll turn it back over to my colleagues at the Housing Solution Labs to talk about the work we're doing together to understand how cities and local communities are experiencing changes in federal funding. And then we'll turn to the real experts on the webinar, the local leaders from Chattanooga, Charlottesville, and Louisville, who will share their experiences navigating this uncertainty. But before I turn it back over, I did want to end on a cautiously encouraging note. While we know that federal-local partnerships are absolutely essential to meeting our nation's growing housing challenges, and that those relationships are at grave risk in the current moment, we also know that in recent years, states and localities have expanded their own policy toolkits and tools for meeting their constituents' housing needs. They have innovated on every front, from land use reforms to financing to reuse of public land to inclusionary zoning. Fortunately, those toolkits are being widely shared and publicized, including on the Local Housing Solutions website. And one set of resources I wanted to share with you all that we recently published for the Lincoln Institute is our Through the Roof report and policy brief. And I'll drop the links to both of those documents in the chat. We originally commissioned this research several years ago to help local communities grappling with the challenge of how to meet their pressing housing needs. And both the report and the policy brief highlight the important role that local governments play in housing policy, including specific policies that local governments can adopt and a comprehensive local housing framework that local governments can use. By sharing these materials and re-emphasizing the broad range of policy tools available at the local level, I do not mean to let the federal government off the hook. We know local governments cannot go it alone. But in these times of great uncertainty, it is worth taking a closer look at what can be done at the local level and take strength and inspiration from each other, which I know is another theme that will run throughout this webinar. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Claudia.
Thank you so much for those thoughts, Solomon. We're now going to hear from Martha Galvez, our Executive Director here at the Housing Solutions Lab. She's going to kick off our presentation.
Thanks, Claudia, and thanks, Solomon, for setting that up and setting this context, and for everyone for calling in today, this afternoon. So I'll spend just a couple of minutes talking about what's motivating this webinar and how we got here today. So as part of our collaboration with Lincoln, at the start of the new federal administration, we started talking to our networks of local government leaders to better understand how changes that were happening at the federal level were affecting their housing policy work locally. So specifically, we wanted to know how cities were experiencing shifts, but also how they were responding in these still really very early days of the federal transition. So in the spring, we fielded a survey of local housing practitioners to ask about their experience. We also held discussions with 4 of our ongoing cohorts of local government leaders and housing authority staff, and held discussions with other housing policy experts in our network. And we received over 100 survey responses from folks in 70 jurisdictions nationwide. Our cohort members represented another 24 places. And across geographies, across roles, across organizations, what we heard from respondents was pretty consistent. And the main theme that we heard over and over again was that the impact of federal level uncertainty in and of itself on local housing leaders' ability to plan and make decisions. So by uncertainty, we mean in the form of potential funding cuts, and we'll talk a lot about that today, but also staffing cuts and changing policy priorities that have disrupted ongoing planning efforts. So for example, we heard about potential cuts, we heard about payment delays for rental assistance programs. We also heard about funding freezes, delays, or uncertainty for funds like the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund or weatherization funds. And we know that city leaders across the country are really closely monitoring these federal shifts as they're happening in real time, but that we heard that tracking and verifying information was really hard to do in a rapidly changing environment, especially in places with smaller teams, smaller staffs dedicated to housing policy work. And this is in large part because of the complicated and fragmented nature of federal funding itself, how it flows down to cities for different aspects of local housing programs and policy work. Uses can vary widely by jurisdiction, and it can be really challenging to track. It can be challenging to document and measure comprehensively and to communicate out to the large range of stakeholders who have an interest in it. There's no single housing funding flow to track, but rather several different flows that can interact differently in different places. But by far the biggest concern that we heard was around the prospect of federal funding cuts themselves. More so than new program requirements or staffing cuts, federal funding was the biggest concern. So that in mind, how are cities responding? We heard that against this backdrop of uncertainty, city officials and housing authority leaders are actively considering new policy options. They're looking for options that don't rely on federal funding, and they're looking for options for state or local dedicated funding sources that can try and backfill some of the expected loss of funds at the federal level. But the reality is that the scale of federal resources flowing down to cities is simply too large to fill, especially in the short term or immediate term, as some cuts are being felt now. And cost-saving measures are already happening. So what does that mean? And as examples, I think we'll probably hear more about these types of issues from our panel. We heard that housing authorities are slowing or pausing new voucher issuances, whether in anticipation of cuts or to absorb emergency housing vouchers, for example, that are being sunsetted out. We also heard from cities, and this has received a fair amount of media attention, that housing development deals have been paused or halted, whether because of actual funding cuts or anticipated cuts, or because of federal delays in planning processes or document reviews or steps and required approvals from the federal level. So where does this leave us? So cities and housing providers we know are attempting to revisit their housing strategies and in real time, and also plan for policy and funding changes that are coming down the pike. But the complexity of federal funding streams can make it really difficult to scenario plan and really difficult to keep stakeholders informed about what's at risk or to mount a well-informed, thoughtful response. And our goal today, building on analyses done by the Furman Center for New York City and also by the Urban Institute in San Francisco, is to try to shed some light on how federal funding supports local housing markets and programs and services, and how cities can think about analyzing those flows, documenting them, understanding them, and communicating them out, right? And especially the potential implications of pending cuts. So with that, I'll pass it to Elisa, who's going to be presenting just a little bit more before we turn to our panel of local experts. And a bit later, after the presentation, I can share some additional resources that will be coming from our lab team.
Thank you, Martha. Hello, everyone. My name is Elisa Hartwell. I'm a data and research associate with the Housing Solutions Lab. And today I'll walk you through how and why cities are mapping out their federal funding streams. But before getting into that, let's quickly refresh ourselves on what the major programs are and what we know about the actual and proposed changes to those flows. So as this chart shows, we can roughly sort the major federal funding flows for housing into three categories. Rental assistance, which is the big one, followed by housing development and preservation funds, and then homelessness assistance. I'll highlight the biggest funds for each category. So note that these are national numbers and for fiscal year 2024. So at more than $32 billion per year, housing choice vouchers are the single largest funding stream and serve about 2.3 million households across the country. I also just point out, not shown in this graph are project-based rental assistance contracts, which is another $15 billion directly paid out to landlords by HUD. The low-income housing tax credit under Housing Development and Preservation, it's the flagship federal affordable housing development program. Since 1986, it's helped create 54,000 developments and cost the federal government about $13 billion in foregone tax revenue every year. But often LIHTC is financed in combination with some of these other programs that are listed here. For homelessness assistance, grants to continuums of care, which are local coalitions of homeless service providers, make up the largest chunk of homelessness assistance at about $4 billion. So there are a lot of programs, and there have been a lot of proposed changes and a lot of actual changes that have taken place. So let's just review those. In early July, the Reconciliation Bill, or the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, expanded LIHTC, which is likely to accelerate affordable housing development. It also made opportunity zones permanent, and this could stimulate development, though our colleagues' research suggests that it does not efficiently target low-income neighborhoods or households. So with that budget law behind us, Congress next needs to appropriate funds for fiscal year 2026. The House Appropriations Committee released a draft spending bill on July 13th. So from that, we believe that PHAs will be able to issue fewer new vouchers, will have fewer resources for administering vouchers, and will likely need to defer capital investments in public housing. It would eliminate the home program as well as choice neighborhoods. And the bill also proposes cutting HUD staff 26%. Outside the budget process, there are other changes that have implications for local housing, including the sunsetting of emergency housing vouchers, as Martha mentioned earlier, and the freezing of several grant programs. So, in light of all those changes and proposed changes, we've highlighted in orange the funding streams that may be most at risk going forward, including vouchers, public housing operating and capital funds, and home funds. But what does this all mean at the local level? So to find out, we thought it would be important to both map out the inflows of federal funds to different cities, because it will look different in different places, and try to better understand the work that those funds do. So why do this work? There are a few different reasons, but the things that we heard directly from the cities we were listening to, um, first is to be able to just proactively prepare for a future that is still unknown. If you try to understand the different streams, where they go, and which ones are at risk, you could identify a few possible but plausible scenarios and strategize responses to those scenarios. The second is to advocate to either federal or state level decision makers or both for the safeguarding of existing funding streams or to try to create new ones. And finally, to the extent that this mapping exercise at the local level is collaborative, it could actually help bring in different stakeholders to the table with different resources and different capacities that a city needs to plan and respond to these changes. So, a little bit on our approach, at the lab, we knew that this kind of analysis was possible and in full swing in big cities. So, as previously mentioned, our colleagues at the NYU Furman Center and the Urban Institute have done in depth analyses of federal housing programs in New York City and San Francisco, respectively. And their analyses suggested the massive impact that HUD funding cuts could have in these cities, particularly New York, which has by far the most public housing and also the most housing vouchers of any city in the country. But these cities are large and have lots of capacity and high quality open data. What about smaller and mid-sized cities? Would this analysis be different? Would the outcomes look different? To find out, we partnered with three cities, Louisville, Kentucky, Chattanooga, Tennessee, and Charlottesville, Virginia. So in each place, we were able to connect with a key local actor who you'll hear from during our panel, who was already thinking about these issues and could help us access information that was not publicly available if we needed to. So for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to focus mainly on our findings in Louisville, but we'll also touch briefly on how they stack up to Charlottesville and Chattanooga. So similar to the national level chart I showed you earlier, this chart shows that rental assistance makes up the biggest slice of federal funds that flow into Louisville. Louisville Metropolitan Housing Authority administers more than 12,000 housing choice vouchers and nearly 3,700 public housing units. And note that we're displaying these numbers in thousands of dollars. So this chart shows that more than $150 million in federal funds went towards rental assistance in Louisville in 2024. Turning to the next largest category, housing development and preservation, we found that nearly $60 million in LIHTC awards went to affordable housing projects in Louisville for 2024. The Housing Authority also planned to spend about $13.6 million on development and rehab. And the Metro government receives community development or CDBG and home block grants directly from HUD, which helps support housing development and preservation to the tune of about $6.5 million. And then there are a few other federal funds in this category, including congressional earmarks for certain projects and a federal grant to do home accessibility modifications for older adults. Finally, federal dollars also support the homelessness response in Louisville. So in 2024, this included more than $23 million for the continuum of care, which includes 17 different organizations that provide rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, and outreach for families and individuals experiencing homelessness. But the Metro government also devoted about $4.5 million of its block grant dollars to preventing and reducing homelessness. So something we wanted to highlight here was how local funds are leveraged. So like some of these grants require matching funds or are paired with local dollars in ways that are relatively easy for us to track. So as you can see, LIHTC and other federal development funds leverage a lot of local funds. So Louisville's local affordable housing trust fund plays a big role in financing affordable and permanent supportive housing projects that also receive federal tax credits. So there's definitely a lot we're not capturing, such as local philanthropic funds that help sustain nonprofits in homelessness prevention and response. But we think this is one way of suggesting the impact and potential magnitude of federal funds. So zooming out a bit, it could also be helpful to see the relative size and impact of spending categories and programs using a tree diagram like this. So here we can see housing funding for Louisville totaled about $280 million in 2024, with over half going to rental assistance programs. So things look a bit different in Chattanooga, where federal funding for housing totaled $164 million for a city of about 190,000. In contrast to Louisville, funding for housing development and preservation outweighs rental assistance, and there's relatively little federal funding for homelessness assistance. Interestingly, the largest funding stream for development and preservation here isn't LIHTC. We learned from Hanukkah, whom you'll hear from in just a little bit, I think, that Chattanooga has historically received little LIHTC funding, especially the valuable 9% credits. So instead, the big other category here reflects a $50 million Choice Neighborhoods grant to redevelop the West Side neighborhood, ultimately creating more than 1,000 homes. But in March, Congress passed a continuing resolution that level funded Choice Neighborhoods through the end of the current fiscal year. But the House proposed no funding for Choice Neighborhoods in fiscal year 26. Next up, so Charlottesville and its surrounding county have a combined population of about 160,000 people and received about $101 million in federal funding for housing in 2024. Here, federal funds for development really dominate, with comparatively little federal support for either rental or homelessness assistance. A lot of this reflects the efforts of just a couple of affordable housing developers, Habitat for Humanity and the Piedmont Housing Alliance. And they've been proactive in competing for and layering tax credits, congressional earmarks, and competitive federal grants and loans. We'll hear more details on this from Sunshine Mathon, Executive Director of the Piedmont Housing Alliance, during our panel. Lastly, I want to briefly touch on another way to approach mapping federal funding flows outside of dollars and cents. We can look at how many households these funds support or how many homes are created. This is pretty challenging to do, as it turns out. We pulled data from a variety of sources, including the HUD data dashboard, local continuum of care dashboards, local action plans, and local press awards notifications, which included units built. So we've bolded the programs at risk for fiscal year 26, and thousands of voucher holders and public housing residents could be impacted by cuts. Households across these cities will also be impacted by the elimination of home, as well as several programs under the other development category, in these cases, choice neighborhoods and price. So for some final thoughts on our analysis, I'd like to hand it over to my colleague, Danya.
Hi, everyone. So in this last part of the presentation, we want to share some thoughts on how other places could embark on a similar analysis. So first, it's helpful to take a step back and consider what sort of story you want to tell. What's going to be the most useful, whether for scenario planning, advocacy, or bringing different stakeholders together. The first question to ask is, what jurisdiction does it make sense to pull data for? If you're scenario planning, who are the key players in your locality and what is their service area? If you're planning to use these data to go talk to your congressional representative, maybe it makes the most sense to focus on the district or even the state as a whole. Another question is, how do you want to communicate the value of these funds? You could try to map all the different agencies and programs that receive funds, focus on the sheer volume of federal funding, try to look at local or state dollars leveraged as we did, or try to measure the impact in terms of households, development projects, or even landlords that have been affected. So once you know what you're trying to achieve and what sort of story you want to tell, the next step is data analysis. We really recommend starting with federal data sources, since they tend to be fairly clean and consistent over time and also pretty easily findable. During our analysis, we relied on 4 key federal data sources, and these include the HUD Awards and Allocations website, which can tell you about formula grants like CDBG that a locality receives, the HUD Community Assessment and Reporting Tool, which is especially helpful for tracking project-based rental assistance, both funding and household served. The HUD's Housing Choice Voucher Dashboard, which tells you the number of vouchers, both housing choice and project-based, administered by any given housing authority, as well as how much funding they are spending. And finally, usaspending.gov, which records all federal grants. The website's a little unwieldy, but it can also help you figure out what you may be missing in terms of development funds. So another really important tool to access data on federal funding sources is through the Urban Institute. Our colleagues at Urban have developed a really wonderful tracker that can tell you all about key flows and recipients at the state and congressional district levels. You can find the link to this tracker on the screen, or I believe it's just been put in the chat. So Urban has also been working on an inventory of data sources capturing federal funding flows for housing programs. And we're delighted that Amanda Hermans, a research associate at Urban, could join us on the webinar today. So if you have any questions about Urban's work or the tracker, I encourage you to drop it in the Q&A. So once you've done this high-level federal data analysis, you can delve deeper into more local resources. This step can be very helpful for getting information on local and private investment, households and individuals impacted, and homes and units developed. So during our analysis, we reviewed annual action plans, which are helpful for figuring out households impacted and allocation of grant money. These are put out by localities that are receiving direct allocations of HUD block grants like CDBG and ESG. Another important tool were budgets and planning documents from local housing authorities and local governments. These were helpful for getting additional investment in these programs. Next are LIHTC and National Housing Trust Fund award documents from state housing finance agencies. And finally, local press releases, newspaper articles, and local data are all super helpful for adding additional color to your report. And finally, we have some tips and tricks for your analysis. The first thing is to remember the 3 major categories of assistance: rental aid, homelessness aid, and housing development and preservation, and use this as a guideline for looking for flows within each of these categories. The next thing is that budget timelines may differ. Local, federal, state governments, and housing authorities may all use different fiscal years and calendar years, and you may not be able to reconcile them, but definitely bear that in mind. The next thing is that different funds may flow into the same projects and serve the same people, so you may not be able to avoid double counting the impact of these programs. The next thing is to check your work for sure. You should compare local and federal estimates to see if they are roughly similar. And finally, even after you've done all this research and something doesn't seem completely right, you should reach out to people in your community. This is a great way to find hard to track data and really build out your analysis.
Thank you so much, Danya, and to all our presenters. I am seeing some great questions in the Q&A. Thank you for those. Keep them coming. We will have about 15 minutes for Q&A after the panel. But now it's my pleasure to introduce our panel. We're joined by Hanneke van Drossen. She's Director of Housing Finance for the City of Chattanooga. Sunshine Mathon is Executive Director of the Piedmont Housing Alliance based in Charlottesville, Virginia. And Tony Curtis is Executive Director of the Metropolitan Housing Coalition in Louisville, Kentucky. Welcome, everyone. So let me start with a broad question that I'll pose to all of you kind of in turn. And I'd like you to share, ideally in just a sentence or two, how you think the shifting federal landscape will affect or is already affecting your community. What, in your eyes, are the key challenges as your community reacts to these changes? And I'll start with you, Hanukkah, if you're ready.
I think, hi everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Hannah Contenders. I'm the Director of Housing and Finance for the city of Chattanooga. And I think for us, so much of our work in the last 2-3 years has been building up Chattanooga's affordable housing ecosystem. For a long time, Chattanooga is a place where the median household could afford the median home. And so we don't have quite the robust network affordable housing developers, although we have some really excellent nonprofits in our space, but we don't have that big kind of lie tech capacity in our local market. And so much of our work has been building up that ecosystem, inviting development to us, and Faircloth throughout has been a huge opportunity there. So the opportunity for additional rental assistance so that we can add that in as gap financing to lie tech projects. We had hundreds of units kind of in the queue ready to go. And the uncertainty around the future funding of Section 8 has caused all those projects to stall. And so affordable housing takes a long time to put these deals together. And not knowing whether or not the funding will be there is causing issues kind of at this point where we're trying to get applications or facilitate applications for the credits. So the freezing up of our development pipeline is really what we're seeing so far.
For sure. Yep. And Tony, I'd love your perspective on this too.
Thank you, Claudia, and great to see everybody. There's a lot going on and a lot predicted. I would say, kind of to sum up everything, we're going to see less housing, less money for direct services and assistance programs, and more homeless folks in our community. I think there's a lot of uncertainty and fear out there right now, which is leading to stagnation. Especially when you're looking at investors pulling out from projects or not choosing to fund projects. You're seeing developers pausing, canceling, or rethinking projects. And it's just a matter of making that financial stack work, which is always the big question, and trying to make that happen. But some other things is that any movement in funding on any of these critical funding streams coming into Louisville, Kentucky, or any community create stressors on the entire system that is already under stress. We're also seeing nonprofit closures or threats of closures occurring across, not just in housing, but in refugee services and a lot of other areas. That's problematic. We also see, and we know this argument doesn't work when we go to local local council members, local government, and to state government, talking about, hey, all this federal funding is not coming in. What are you going to do about it? That cannot be replaced. And so that's an argument for, hey, what are we going to use our rainy day funds, right? Monsoon season is now. We're experiencing that in the housing world, and we need to take that on. And a lot of this and a lot of the work that MHC is doing in our community, and I know others as well, is what do we do about coalition building and what does that look like? And that's going to be one of the most important pieces to the puzzle.
Thanks. Yeah, I really appreciate you mentioning the shifts, outside of what we would consider typical housing programs that yet will also affect housing need. Sunshine, let me ask you the same thing. What are you seeing in Charlottesville?
Good morning, or actually good afternoon, everyone. Sorry. I'm Sunshine Mathon, Executive Director of Piedmont Housing. And before I respond to the question, I will say that as I usually in an intro, I'll say that we're an affordable housing organization, and we do a broad range of work. But in this day and age, I've started to retool the language that we use, and I'll just say we do workforce housing, housing for seniors, and economic development. And I highlight that recalibration of how we talk about ourselves to be adapting to a changing environment where the layers of uncertainty and the real need to shine a light on the impact of the kind of work we do is not about them, but it's about all of us. And in this environment, like the work of building workforce housing or housing for seniors, for a long time I talk about it as financial architecture. And as an architect by training, I spend a lot of my time in this space trying to piece together all the layers of funding that come together to make an incredibly complex project happen. And now we are in the last stages of financial Jenga, where all the pieces are getting pulled out effectively. And it hasn't quite collapsed yet, but the risk of collapse is frankly imminent. And so I'll just last comment I'll say at the moment is that the impact is multifaceted. One, Hanneke talked about the slowdown in projects. That is certainly true for us as well. The thing that's not really talked about when in this sort of idea of uncertainty is actually really expensive. It adds to the long-term holding costs of a project because it takes longer. It means that we have to spend more staff time. It means that as we wait, construction costs escalate. It is uncertainty actually is the antithesis of trying to get things done efficiently. And so it's irony given the kind of federal stance currently. And then the other layer I'll throw in there is a little bit more human, which is I have residents and community members on a weekly basis reaching out to me concerned about their future housing and whether, like, even the housing that they're in, and, are the vouchers going to stay? Am I going to be able to afford it? And that has just only continued to grow. And that's just like a general malaise and stress level, increased stress level on already stressed communities.
Thanks, Sunshine. So my next question is for you, Tony. One area where future policy and funding definitely seem uncertain is homelessness assistance. And so as the leader of a coalition that includes providers who serve this especially vulnerable population, could you speak just a little bit more about what you think the risks are in Louisville?
Most definitely, Claudia, and I think it's important to, I think, like you pointed out earlier, the landscape is continually shifting each and every day, each and every version of potential funding cuts that we see, depending on what version you look at. But I think first and foremost, we have to acknowledge that these are people's lives where we are dealing with in this funding conversation. It's people. It's actually the life and death with a lot of folks as well, not having stable housing. And also a little bit of what I said earlier is the infrastructure, the threat to infrastructure from a direct services perspective, from a bricks and sticks perspective, about organizations who provide those direct services and the permanent supportive housing to folks. I think it's also important to acknowledge that we've seen two very different funding proposals. I don't think either is ideal for our world. I don't think it's not as bad is an acceptable position for us either. But the reality of the situation is that the initial funding proposal we saw from the Trump administration was a draconian cut across the board to any and all housing, not just HUD staff, which provide critical services and input and timeliness on signing off on things and critical support. But the thought of let's talk continuum care dollars, ESG, HOPWA dollars. There was a consideration of block granting these funds to the states. To Kentucky, that was a net positive outside of Louisville. But for Louisville itself, you said it earlier, we get about $23 million in continuum care dollars. We were going to see about a $16 million decrease in dollars. So if 1,700 to 1,800 homeless individuals in our community people thought was bad, that would have drastically and exponentially increased that situation in our community. We also saw, but under the House version, we're seeing kind of an increase, I think, in continuum of care dollars, ESG dollars, domestic violence dollars. Home dollars on both sides of those equations are eliminated, and that is critical funding to make the stacks works for affordable housing and permanent supportive housing, to fund projects and actually put roofs over people's heads. So both proposals eliminate those funding streams. I think Section 8 and public housing decreases on both sides really put at risk people's stability. In Louisville, Kentucky, we have over 21,000 HUD assisted units in our community. People that are stably housed, there's going to be some decision making where vouchers aren't going to be able to remain, and people are going to have to make hard decisions that are in positions of power in the housing authority, in the city, and with the state financial agency that issues vouchers for 118 counties. And so that's critical to housing stability, and that's really going to take away stability. A couple other things we need to think about are CDBG funds, eliminated in the Trump budget, but stabilized in the House version. HUD staffing's down, public housing dollars, I think 18% is what goes down on that. And then something we haven't talked about is fair housing dollars for preventing discrimination in housing. Those dollars were going to dry up and, if not, disappear. That's a critical part of this discussion on the housing landscape, is protecting people and giving people access to critical housing needs. And one last thing, I think, is thinking about eviction prevention dollars. We know from over the COVID during the pandemic that those were critical funds to help people and families meet the need when they had to go to the court to face eviction programs. Louisville was very good at getting its money out during that period and preventing evictions for a lot of folks. And we've seen those numbers continue to rise now after those monies have disappeared. Our local government, local organizations were in the courts actually negotiating and making sure that these dollars were known and trying to save people housing, paying back rents and paying forward. So I think a lot of this is shifting day to day. We need to understand the total impact. And there's some voices that aren't at the table right now. And I think there's a lot of apartment associations, landlord professional associations that aren't going to realize the impact if vouchers are cut. That's going to affect bottom line. That's going to affect stability of their housing as well, because they have to pay mortgages in many respects as well. Especially a lot of small landlords. And if these funding structures go away, that destabilizes their investment as well. So there's going to be a lot of critical coalition building and uncomfortable conversations with non-traditional coalitions. And we have to embrace that and have those conversations.
Thanks, Tony. Yeah, we're going to talk more about how you build an effective narrative with these data, who the constituencies are. So I really appreciate that last point that you made. Let me now turn to Hanneke to talk a little bit about the rental assistance piece. So as you know, Hanneke, these funding streams are among the largest that are flowing into localities. And you and your team have already embarked on an analysis to unpack the impact of a federal housing voucher in Chattanooga specifically. Could you tell us a little bit about that work and what your goals for that project are?
Yeah, thanks so much. So Chattanooga receives $40 million approximately per year for housing choice vouchers. And there's a lot of great research out there on how that funding impacts the tenants who receives those vouchers. But we don't have as much good understanding of what the impacts are of that money in our local economy. And so that was something we really wanted to understand as we were responding to potential cuts to that funding is what's that going to do to our rental market? Because as the kind of housing team at the city, we're responsible for the housing market overall and not just that specific segment. So we kind of went through different layers of the economic impacts, let's call them the ripple effects of just yanking money out. Now, I understand that the proposals have really swung. And so this is more of a thought experiment than anything else of like, where does that voucher flow? How does that money circulate through our economy? So the first and kind of most direct impact is homelessness. So those tenants who have vouchers in Chattanooga, 75% of them are earning less than $22,000 a year. These are households whose income simply is not high enough to afford rental housing on the private market. And so the voucher kind of gives them that extra money to be able to afford a market rate apartment in kind of the lower end of the rental spectrum. And so yank that subsidy out, $500 a month apartments just don't really exist like that in Chattanooga. And so in all likelihood, these households will either double up or become homelessness. And homelessness is not free. It actually costs quite a bit for us as a municipality. There's an increased demand on public safety. There's an increased fire service demand, increased demand on the emergency or the services we have, EMS services. This all is a substantial kind of cost of having an individual living on the street beyond the sort of personal cost to that individual. And that burden gets shifted onto the local taxpayer to provide those services because fire, police, the stuff that we are funding locally. So that's kind of the first layer of impact. The next one has to do with local landlords. So it's not just the tenants who are no longer able to afford the rent. The landlord no longer has the tenant who can afford that rent. And so if we think about the broader housing market and the kind of rental demand, the money everyone in Chattanooga has to pay for rent, if we pull $40 million out of that rental demand, that means that the housing on the fringes of the market that likely is accepting these Section 8 vouchers is going to see a loss of that steady income. And so 85% of our participating landlords are Tennessee residents, 71% are based in our county. And so that is something that hits local landlords more so than the big national firms. And so losing that income can lead to loan defaults, deferred maintenance, or forced property sale. And that contributes over time to just broad housing deterioration, gentrification of neighborhoods, and consolidation of ownership of those assets from local smaller owners to large absentee landlords who come buy things up in that fire sale. So that's the impact kind of to the local landlords. Then you have the owners of affordable housing. And these are projects that have maybe a contract for a 20-year contract with HUD or with our PHA for continual voucher subsidy over time. We call that project-based vouchers. So instead of an individual having a voucher and finding a unit on the private market, this building is a contract with the government or with the housing authority, and the voucher lives kind of with the unit. Those buildings, the whole financing of that building is dependent on that consistent revenue stream. That is the funding that they are leveraging their debt against to do renovations. If that contract were to be suddenly broken, that building is immediately upside down. The tenants would need to be evicted. Maybe they convert to market rate if they can, but there's still like the deed restrictions on the project. So there's a real crisis there of just the federal government potentially reneging on its commitments through a contract that it's made with that owner. So there's some difficulty there. And then it goes further than kind of existing landlords, existing operators of affordable housing. It creeps into the pipeline of new development. So first you have the affordable housing development. We call this capital A. It has federal subsidies. And nearly all affordable housing development relies on federal funding. And as Tony mentioned, as Sunshine mentioned, not just one source of federal funding, but a whole layer cake of them. And for us, Section 8 vouchers are a really critical piece of that layer cake because we don't have large affordable housing trust funds to fill the gaps otherwise. So especially with the 4% low-income housing tax credit, that tax credit alone isn't really enough to make a new construction project feasible. So you need other sources of funding. We don't have a lot of those locally. And so the vouchers are the critical piece to kind of make those deals work. And so through the Restore Rebuild program, formerly known as Faircloth to RAD, which I kind of mentioned earlier, Chattanooga has sort of leeway to bring 1,250 new affordable units online through new Faircloth units. And that's a huge opportunity. And those were changes, kind of tweaks made recently at HUD. And that's something we've really seen as a catalyst to new development. $350 million in construction would be generated with an estimated kind of $14 million boost of federal subsidy flowing into our market. As we all know, the $350 million of construction is generating jobs. Those workers are going and shopping in the local markets and it's generating sales. That dollar cycles through the economy many times. And so we're losing out on that production that kind of we have a queue of developers who are interested in doing it. But now that the funding is uncertain, that is dry and that pipeline is kind of vulnerable for years to come. And then there's not just the capital A affordable housing developers, but also the kind of private development market. Again, the way I like to think about this is the vouchers are stimulating demand. They're subsidizing demand, having more rent dollars in our market available than would be there otherwise, $40 million more. And so, you know, in a market that has a really tight supply, say there's not a lot of developable land or the zoning's really restrictive, just adding new demand into that market is going to potentially drive prices up. And we see that when there's a lot of new people moving to a city and there's not new housing being built for those people. But Chattanooga's permitted over 8,000 new residential units since 2021. We are a very elastic housing market. We build in response to that demand. And so pulling that subsidy out of our market really collapses that demand for new construction. And so it's not just affordable housing development, but also housing development writ large that is kind of responsive to the overall amount of rent dollars in our market. And there's something really critical here, just to give a sort of like sense of the magnitude. Our city operating budget sits around $330 million. $40 million of vouchers is a level of funding we cannot make up locally. That there is not the available capital to kind of fix that hole. And as has been sort of brought up here, there are many streams of federal funding that typically flow to localities that may not be flowing anymore. And so we simply do not have the resources, the tax base locally to absorb all of those costs. We really have benefited from federal investment in our market in that way, and it's stimulated housing development at all kind of levels. And so the broader economic impact really comes down to like, what is the activity in our market? How has this $40 million infusion stimulated new construction, stimulated local landlords, and what might it mean to suddenly, and I think especially suddenly, yank that money out of our system? That's what we've been thinking through.
Wow.
And the part of Section 8
Yeah.
vouchers that maybe we tend to focus on the impact for tenants, which is well documented and studied, that it's really great for those households who receive the vouchers. But from a local economy perspective as well, this is just a huge infusion of capital into our market to stimulate our housing.
Thank you for laying out all those spillovers for us. I think it's so important to think about. And you mentioned this layer cake of federal funding streams that happens for new development. I want to turn now to Sunshine. Sunshine, you are a nonprofit affordable housing developer in Charlottesville, Virginia. So you know firsthand about the complex capital stack that it takes to make these projects work. Can you tell us more about that layering and how changes at the federal level can affect your work?
Thanks, Claudia. As I've been listening to other people speak, I've been furiously writing down comments that I wanted to include, but I know I can't include everything. So forgive me if my thoughts are a little jumbled. There's a lot of pieces that I want to touch on, so I'm going to try to do a little scatter shot here. I'll start by highlighting that as an organization, let me go back for a second. As an organization, we have staff dedicated to eviction prevention work, not just in our properties, but across the region, all the way through homelessness. And then the affordable rental housing piece, that workforce housing and housing for seniors that I referenced, is sort of our core. And I'll limit my comments to there, but I just want to echo that, from this vantage of seeing the kind of the full spectrum, I can't touch on the impact of all the cuts from homeownership to homelessness, but Hanukkah and Tony have done some of that already, which is great. At the development, looking through the development lens, there are essentially 4 buckets of costs for any project. And this is market rate or affordable. Land is a cost. As we all know, land has been going up rapidly up in costs for a long time now, and at a clip accelerated higher than inflation, typically for other commodities. Construction costs is another and probably the largest single cost of any development project. Those costs continue to escalate. They have been since the pre-pandemic. They obviously had big boosts or increases during the pandemic. And then in the tariff environment, we're starting to see that re-escalate again beyond the sort of normal inflationary index. Cost of capital. So when we do a project, we have to borrow for construction. We don't get to the permanent financing until the very end. So we have a cost of capital during construction, we have cost of capital in the permanent financing. In both those scenarios, when we used to be able to borrow at say 3 or 3.5% rates, and now we're at 7 to 8% rates, that is literally translates to millions of dollars in a project of additional cost that we didn't have to a couple of years ago when the interest rates were lower. So that's an increase in cost. And then soft costs is the fourth bucket, and that's everything from architectural and civil engineering to legal expenses to internal staff expenses. And this goes back to my comment earlier that uncertainty is expensive. Uncertainty increases complexity, which increases time, and it all escalates and frankly increases legal costs, increases every potential cost in that sort of soft cost bucket. So not a single one of those buckets has been going down in value and cost. All the costs have been going up. On the other side of the equation, you have to find the sources for construction so that ideally you can subsidize at the front end so that ultimately your permanent debt on the project is payable through your reduced rents. And that's the typical LIHTC structure. You want to get as much subsidy as there as you can because you have reduced rents and you can't increase those over time like you can in a market rate development, that you have to be able, you do have permanent debt you have to pay. And if you can't pay it, that's a problem. The sources, in the beginning of the presentation, a number of sources were identified. That is the majority, but there are actually some additional sort of more esoteric sources that I want to touch on a couple. So home and CDBG were referenced in our local sense in Charlottesville. Home and CDBG are not substantial contributors to our affordable housing development because we have fairly small allocations. But at the state level, those are pretty significant. We get state, some of the state level funding comes in that's home and CDBG. Those funds, as folks may or may not know, in the president's skinny budget are essentially zeroed out. And then a home, in any case, in the House's THUD committee budget have been proposed to be zeroed out. We'll see around what the Senate, unless the Senate their THUD committee has announced something in the last hour or so. They have not announced their details yet. So we'll see how that gets reconciled. But there's a little bit of a maybe glimmer of hope on the House side, which is there is some effort. I'll just acknowledge Congressman Flood, Republican from Nebraska, that has been spearheading an effort to try to save home and, in fact, actually retool it to make it more efficient and more responsive to community need. I don't know if his efforts are going to prevail, but I strongly celebrate his effort in partnership with Congressman Clemmer, a Democrat from Missouri. They're working together to try to do that. So just lifting up that effort. We'll see if they're successful or not. There's a number of funding sources, not through HUD, but through Treasury that we haven't really touched on. Everything from the National Housing Trust Fund, Capital Magnet Fund, et cetera. And those new market tax credits, those sources we actually have been using over the last few years as critical gap fillers to keep projects flowing. We haven't seen what the House or the Senate is going to suggest in terms of maintaining or cutting that sector of funding. But I'm looking at that carefully because that's a really, for us, has been a really important source. I'm gonna get to LIHTC last, the low income housing tax credits. The other piece that I want to highlight is there was another whole source of funds that as of 12 months ago, we were seeing as a little bit of a Hail Mary to help us close gaps in this as costs continue to increase, which related to green building, sustainability, and solar, which have now been effectively eviscerated. And so those sources were going to be our gap fillers. We already commit in our development pro forma and our the way we do work to doing deep levels of energy efficiency and solar in all of our projects. I see that as there's a direct alignment, in my opinion, between the mitigation of climate change and the benefits to low-income households. So for me, it's a no-brainer. And we've been doing that for a while. We've had some state resources to tap into. Those are gone now effectively. So this federal surge in funding was going to be the thing that helped us and many other developers get across the finish line. But that uncertainty, it's not uncertainty, that certainty of that funding essentially being gone is now deeply impactful and having us rethink our strategies. I'll touch briefly on opportunity zones because it came up at some point in the conversation. I will say I'm not aware of except for maybe like one or two very big exceptions. I'm not aware of a single affordable housing project that has been able to meaningfully connect OZ funding and LIHTC or other federal sources. They are just structurally different and they don't line up well. So it's the reason we've seen OZ's been reasonably effective at catalyzing market rate development, which of course, yes, that's important. We need that too. But I would not want to make the mistake of somehow saying, at least as OZs as they've existed, have had any real meaningful impact on the affordable housing sector. They just haven't, frankly, with a few rare exceptions. The last piece I want to touch on is LIHTC. And so one of the silver linings we saw in the tax reconciliation bill that passed a couple of weeks ago was an increase in LIHTC by 12%. And a few other tweaks that are going to increase the availability of 4% and 9% LIHTC funding. However, I want to put a big giant asterisk there, which is, I mean, that's great, that's good. But anecdotally, I have had, tens of conversations with other nonprofit and for-profit LIHTC developers and LIHTC syndicators. No one has any real belief that that 12% increase is actually going to be a meaningful increase in LIHTC funding. Everyone looks at that and says, yes, there's going to be an increase in available credits, but the value of those credits is actually going to subside to a certain extent, perhaps even more than the value of the increased number of credits in the first place. And in part, it's because it's a supply-demand ratio. And in this environment of hyper pro-business and reducing of corporate tax rates, the value of those LIHTC they just dissipate. And so, I would say anecdotally, a decade ago, I was doing work in Austin, Texas, and we would be, you could pretty predictably aim for about $1 on the dollar plus or minus for the value of the tax credits. Right now in Charlottesville, we're below 80 cents on the dollar for the value of those tax credits. And it's very possible that we could see a dip down to the low 70 cents on the dollar. And just to quantify that, every penny is, somewhat, depending on the scale of the project, might be $150,000 to $250,000 equivalent of actual cash value towards construction. So a 10-cent decrease is $1.5 million to $2.5 million decrease in value of those tax credits. So I just want to add that asterisk. And then the last tool in the tool belt that a developer has to close costs or to increase revenue, I'll say, put it that way, to increase the sources in order to get a project complete is by changing the profile of the depth of affordability. When you have a 40% AMI rent, that works for that household. When you have a 60% AMI rent, it works for a different profile of household. They each bring in a certain amount of annual revenue. Well, if you go to all 60% rents, you get more revenue, which allows you to pull in more debt, which might allow some projects to move forward when you have increased costs but reduced sources. And I highlight that in particular because in this environment, and I'll keep my last comment here short, that we actually are in a pivot point where we really risk leaving those that need the deepest levels of affordability behind, more than they already are. I mean, they're already left behind in many ways, but the risk is actually escalating right now. And I'll pause there and probably be able to talk about that more during the question piece, Q&A.
Thank you so much. I mean, the level of complexity that you're already dealing with blows my mind. We're getting some great questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to take my prerogative as moderator to ask one more question before we get to those. And again, if you can keep your responses short, that would be wonderful. But I'd love to know, I mean, you all are already convening stakeholders and reaching out to elected officials. You are telling the story. Can you tell us a little bit more about the approach that you're taking? What do you think are the narratives that are most powerful right now? And let's start with you, Tony.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll be short and try to keep this as concise as possible. I think the thing I said earlier was be prepared for a lot of uncomfortable and kind of non-traditional conversations with stakeholders. Bring people into the room that you know you're going to disagree with. Make sure they all get in the room. Two things that we're doing through the Kentucky Housing Corporation, our state financing agency, and a lot of stakeholders across the state, having conversations, intentional conversations I think it's every week or every other week right now on updates to what's going on. So we're all on the same page. We're trying to have a uniform narrative and really engage on this issue. And so everybody understands what the costs are, not only locally to especially some of the larger cities. We have 120 counties, so it's always Louisville, Lexington, and balance of state, which is 118 counties, which you can imagine how hard that is to the lack of uniformity across all those counties. So continuing to have those conversations, build that coalition at the state level to have all the stakeholders organizationally at the table. The other thing is we convened a meeting of congressional staffers for Louisville. So we had our staffers from both of our U.S. senators' offices, Senator McConnell, Senator Paul, and then Representative Morgan McGarvey's representatives were there. We brought together a lot of stakeholders from Louisville. We had that could be a lot of people. We limited it about 30 people in the initial conversation and hope to follow up. But as you can imagine, there's a wide berth of belief between that political spectrum that's represented in the room. But we needed everybody in the room to have an open, honest conversation and really see that fear of what that cliff is going to be. I mean, this could be a great housing regression that we're facing right now. And we needed everybody to know what it is. Even though we didn't agree on 100% on outcomes, we might be able to agree on a certain percentage of things that we need to attack and get support on. So don't be afraid to have those conversations. They're going to be uncomfortable. I've been in a lot of uncomfortable conversations as of late, but don't be afraid to reach out and have a conversation. Sometimes you might be surprised about who might be an ally on an issue. So that's what we're doing here in Kentucky, and we'll continue to organize around.
Thanks, Tony. Okay, a sentence from you, Sunshine, and then Hanukkah will have the last word.
I'll keep it short. I'll just reference what I talked about previously, which is I just don't talk about affordable housing anymore. Like I talk about workforce housing, housing for seniors, and economic development. And it sort of reinforces the point that Hanukkah was trying to make earlier too, which is that all three of those things are crucial to the economic vibrancy and safety net for our seniors in a way that I think it's almost universal in terms of being able to get that message across. And I think that's how we have to speak about it now.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think from our end, important conversations we've been having are what local government can and can't do. So, with the things that are within our control locally, we have been full steam ahead. We've completely overhauled our zoning code. We've made tweaks to the building code, like all the things that are within our control, making public land more available through a land bank authority. We are doing those things. What we can't do is make up a $40 million gap or bring the kind of local funding that LIHTC brings to the table. We just simply don't have the resources for that locally. And I think that's part of the advocacy we've been doing is like, look, we're doing what we can to stimulate demand or stimulate construction in the market. 8,000 new units in the last 4 years is pretty good for a city of 180,000 people. We are building, but we simply cannot replace those federal resources.
Great. All right, so turning now to our audience, and we've got Solomon online for this part. We've also got Amanda from the Urban Institute. Our first question comes from Lauren. She wants to know if people are needing to prioritize which area to fight for, how do you suggest we think through that process of prioritizing at the local level? And she adds, these data summaries are certainly helpful, but what questions should localities ask themselves as they do this prioritization? And that's fair game for anyone.
I'll jump in. MHC is works on fair, accessible, and affordable housing issues. So conversations in our community are constantly around whether it's homelessness or housing. It's a housing supply issue. We don't have enough units across the housing continuum, right? We need to be building it across the continuum because it's dynamic and people are moving up and down it constantly. And so we're having, that issue alone is the hardest one to get to, and it's the most complex. A lot of what Sunshine was saying about the complexities of putting those financial stacks together, I think is the concentration, because that involves permanent supportive housing as well, which includes direct services.
Thanks. Yeah, does anyone want to add to that?
I'll just reinforce what Hanukkah was saying earlier, which is, Chattanooga's example of all pistons firing at the local level where there is agency. I would throw Charlottesville in that same realm. We have been doing so for the last number of years. The amount of funding we commit towards affordable housing on a per capita basis is the same level as a DC or San Francisco. It's a pretty extraordinary commitment, and in and of itself is insufficient. No matter how many tools we have in our tool belt, we should and could and will be doing all of those things, but we still need that state and federal partnership.
Great. We have a question about the potential to consolidate services and increase regionalization in a future with less federal support. Have more regional responses come up in your communities?
I'll jump in quickly and just say it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. I would say on some level right now, I mean, there has been growing effort in our region to try to coordinate transportation funding and transportation planning and to a lesser extent housing related. But the other factor that we haven't really referenced in this conversation so far is that localities are facing their own cuts at the federal level. Particularly if they're going to be taking a stand around DEI or other equity issues like Charlottesville. And so they're struggling with how to plan their own uncertainty. And so when you are operating in a space of uncertainty, it makes it harder to coordinate with other entities in a way, because you're not that you're in direct competition for resources, but it just moves you into a scarcity mindset. So it's a challenge, to be honest, at the moment.
Solomon, yeah.
Yeah, I'll add to that. I mean, I agree. It's, regional housing solutions is something I've been working on for a long time. I see a tremendous benefit to regional collaboration, particularly from the perspective of fair housing and equitable distribution of resources. And there's been a lot of work over the years to coordinate more in order to have a more fair, kind of a fair share approach to affordable housing, as well as connecting affordable housing to transportation and other amenities, as you were mentioning, Sunshine. I do think this is a more difficult time to support that collaboration because of reduced resources and uncertainty. But I think it's a great question to ask whether that also might add more of an imperative for more regional collaboration, even if it's more difficult. I do think, and I know Lauren mentioned this in response in the chat, there's different ways of thinking about regionalism, and in the housing space, we have seen some moves towards more consolidation and regional collaboration among housing authorities and COCs to better deliver housing-related services, including portability of the voucher to give people more options to move across a region, delivering pooled resources to deliver services to end homelessness, and just generally to address housing needs across the region more holistically. So there is some consolidation or collaboration among housing agencies. And then I think we've also had, just this long-standing among MPOs and COGs efforts to be more coordinated from a planning perspective in terms of regional housing plans or data sharing, but without a lot of teeth to a lot of those efforts. And then the last thing to think about is, which is very rare, just revenue sharing and pooled resources, like setting up a regional housing trust fund, which has been explored and done in a couple places. But yeah, I think I think it's both a difficult time to think about regional collaboration, but maybe, as I think the person posing the question was suggesting, an important time for us to talk about it.
Yeah, I would like to throw it there. I mean, we've kind of had some forced, more or less, with disasters in Kentucky, tornadoes in the west and flooding in the east, that have had forced kind of a regional response to housing or housing need. One thing that has really, I think, brought kind of the housing to the forefront statewide politically on the political landscape is the State Chamber of Commerce really focused on the need for housing in their local agendas plan for the state. And that really pushed the conversation, and that opened doors. It's amazing, you frame housing as an economic development conversation and people go, hey, you know what, that's not a bad idea. But it's still trying to define where those funding structures come from and where you divide those and share those funding structures is always a interesting conversation.
Yes. Well, we have time for one more question, I think. And this is a question about generating local revenue for affordable housing. We heard Hanneke say that local dollars can't possibly fill the hole that federal dollars would leave, but we also heard that communities are pursuing local revenue streams for housing. Can we talk a little bit more about that? Are there new or renewed efforts to generate dedicated affordable housing funds in your communities?
Yes, and there's also regression there. Our local government just passed a budget and went from a $15 million commitment last year to the local affordable housing trust fund and cut it by $2.5 million to $12.5 million. So that's unfortunate. We were hoping to go the other way and increase it to about 20 million, but that didn't happen. And looking at the political landscape, a question of whether we can rely on year by year contributions through bonds to be able to make that happen, or if we can't get to a dedicated funding source in Kentucky on the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, or in Louisville on the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, and that's a problematic thing because it becomes very politically. But it's not just a $2.5 million cut. If they turn every dollar for $13 at the trust fund, that's like $32.5 million funding cut to actual affordable housing landscape. So that's a problem, and we need to figure that out. And it's becoming harder conversation at the local when there's not really much state support on the trust fund side either.
Got it. So that path forward might not be the clearest either, but certainly important. Sunshine, do you want to add one more thought?
Yeah, I'll just add more broadly in Virginia in general, one of the sort of newish sources is coming out of data center. And this isn't relevant for us in our region, but data centers and getting those permitted and built. Many localities are trying to utilize the permitting process to basically be able to get some revenue, and many of them, not all of them, are putting it towards affordable housing. So that's a new source. It's sort of a strange one, but it is. And then I'll just say in Charlottesville, we, in our recent new zoning code and inclusionary zoning policy, we also have an updated and deeper level of contribution to our affordable housing fund through development by right within the community. And then in particular, as a college town with UVA here, with the increase in student housing that continues to grow, trying to apply and get some additional funding to support affordable housing out of those developments too. So those are.
All right, well, maybe just a minute to add anything that you feel is burning that you haven't said. Hanukkah, anything that you'd want to add?
Um, no, I think this has been a great conversation, and it also teases out just the complexity of how affordable housing is delivered in the US. And I think there are some, I think, good impulses to take another look at whether that complexity is serving us. And I think there's a lot of room to grow in reform and to make essentially to have more of those dollars that are invested in affordable housing make their way into the sticks and bricks and not into all the steps it takes to get there. But what is clear is that sustained investment in housing is essential to the kind of economic vitality of our city, of cities across the country. We talk about it in terms of economic development now, but I think it's really important. Like, it is totally aligned with that. And I think we've done ourselves a disservice to not emphasize how much houses are where jobs go to sleep at night. And so by underinvesting that over and through programs that maybe could stand to be made more efficient, we have done ourselves a disservice and hampered the development of our economy. So, more investment, better investment is the rallying cry I come to, but investment all the same.
I love that. Yeah, maybe we need a part 2 in this webinar series, reimagining how we fund housing programs in the US. So that's great. I am going to turn it back over to Martha at this point to share some closing thoughts. Thank you so much to our panel.
Yeah, mainly I just want to, express our gratitude for having you here today, but also for the work that you're doing in your communities every day. It's really just inspiring to hear everything that you've already been doing up until this point and the roles that you're playing right now. So thank you for spending some time with us and sharing your expertise. We really appreciate it. And to Solomon and to Lincoln for supporting this work today. So we are still tracking what's going on. This is not the last word or work that we're doing in this space around changing federal housing funding and policies. We'll be posting work related to this conversation on localhousingsolutions.org, our website. We will have the recording and the materials from today, and also some of the materials that we're producing for these 3 cities. In addition, another topic we've been following closely is the discussion about potential work requirements and time limits in federal rental assistance. And we published a brief on it last week. Claudia was the lead author on that with our colleague, Ellie Lockhead. That is already available on our website, and within the next month, we'll be hosting a webinar on that analysis. And then finally, soon in August, we'll be issuing a call for cities to participate in what we call our Housing Solutions Workshop. It's an intensive 3-week training for teams of local housing leaders to come together, work with other cities towards developing or updating a comprehensive local housing strategy. So we heard both Hanukkah and Sunshine talk about, are you already doing all the things that you can do at the local level? A big emphasis of this workshop is understanding what those things are and how to look at your existing policy portfolio and see where your options are for adding reform opportunities. And then finally, as we mentioned, the Urban Institute has been working with the San Francisco Foundation to understand federal funding flows in the Bay Area. They'll be posting that work within the coming weeks, and also creating a sort of an explainer piece on the various federal housing streams in the fall. So we really hope that you will stay in touch, whether through our newsletter, or also you can always reach out to us on Ask the Lab on our website. We welcome questions or requests for help. And I think I will leave it at that, with more thanks to our amazing panelists, and thank you for all the work that you're doing.
Thank you. All right.